Let's talk about the end of World War I. By late 1918, it was becoming increasingly apparent the Central Powers were doomed for defeat. The intervention of the United States and their subsequent 100 Days offensive spelled disaster for the Imperial German Army. Within Germany, morale was at an all-time low. Desertions and calls for withdrawal were becoming more common every day. In November 1918, German sailors mutinied, triggering the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. This ultimately resulted in the overthrow of the imperial government and the establishment of the Weimar Republic. In the context of such chaos, Germany was forced to move toward an armistice. In January 1918, American President Woodrow Wilson laid out his famous 14 points. The 14 points set forth a plan for post-war Europe. Wilson envisioned an end to hostilities and a Europe reconfigured on the principles of free trade, open agreements, democracy, and self-determination, among others. Wilson's 14 points provided the basis for Germany's armistice with the Allies. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the Armistice of Compiègne went into effect. The armistice is named after the Compiègne Forest in northern France. At this location, German officials were received aboard French Marshal Ferdinand Foch's stopped railroad car, and after 3 days of talks, signed an armistice. In reality, there was very little negotiating going on. Germany virtually had no choice but to submit to Allied terms and conditions. Major hostilities thus formally ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. But remember, this was only an armistice, not a permanent peace treaty. Interestingly enough, in a bitter twist of fate, Adolf Hitler would board the same train carriage in June 1940 and force the French to sign another armistice, one that essentially turned France over to Nazi occupation. That is another lesson for another time, however. One more side note. The federal holiday we know as Veterans Day evolved from Armistice Day, the annual celebration of the Armistice of Compiègne. So next Veterans Day, be mindful of what happened aboard a small railroad car in the Compiègne Forest of France. While the actual fighting had come to an end under the Armistice of Compiègne, a permanent peace treaty took longer to iron out. The Paris Peace Conference began in January 1919 and lasted roughly a year. The goal of the conference was to secure a lasting European peace, one that hopefully would prevent future wars from breaking out. The conference was a major diplomatic event with over 30 countries represented. Among the leading figures at the conference were Georges Clemenceau from France, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, and Woodrow Wilson from the United States. These leaders are sometimes referred to as the Big Four. President Wilson suggested a peace centered around his 14 points. He also promoted the formation of the League of Nations, which was an international council aimed at maintaining world peace. Think of the League of Nations as a sort of precursor to the United Nations. As much as President Wilson championed the League of Nations, the United States did not join. The U.S. Senate voted down American participation in Wilson's beloved League. The major product of the Paris Peace Conference was the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles formally ended World War I. It was signed June 28, 1919, 5 years to the date of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Just as in the Armistice of Compiègne, Germany had virtually no room for negotiations. The ravaged nation was basically forced to accept whatever treaty it was presented with. One of the most controversial conditions of the Treaty of Versailles was outlined in Article 231, also known as the War Guilt Clause. This section required Germany to take full responsibility for all damage done throughout the war. It also required Germany to make territorial concessions and pay enormous reparations. Requirements for disarmament and limitations on military capabilities were also written in. Basically, it was an admission of guilt. The war was Germany's fault. Article 231 was written by U.S. diplomats Norman Davis and John Foster Dulles. The general consensus among historians is that the Treaty of Versailles was unduly harsh toward Germany. It has normally been seen as a victor's peace. Many historians cite the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles as a major cause of the rise of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialism during the 1920s and 1930s. Many people do not realize that the United States did not actually accept the Treaty of Versailles. While other European countries agreed to it, the U.S. Senate failed to ratify the treaty. As a result, peace between Germany and the United States was not technically put in place until the Treaty of Berlin in 1921. Of course, most textbooks fail to mention this. Let's review. As World War I was winding down, American President Woodrow Wilson developed a plan for post-war peace in Europe. He called this his 14 points. Among the 14 points were the principles of free trade, open agreements, democracy, and self-determination. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the Armistice of Compiègne went into effect, bringing an end to major hostilities. The armistice was signed in a railway car in the Compiègne forest of northern France. A few months later, in January 1919, the Paris Peace Conference began, with diplomats arriving from a host of countries. At the conference, plans were laid out for the League of Nations, an international council charged with maintaining world peace. On June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, officially ending World War I. Under Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war and its damage. This section is often called the War Guilt Clause.